Aha! It's bonus time at the Floyd's podcast, everybody, and going through this content together is going to be super helpful for us to understand this grand, overarching story of the Bible, which is all about cosmic redemption. And it's going to be super helpful, specifically considering that, one, we're going through this mini-series on hell, and two, we're smack in the middle of talking about what is often that really scary word, which is judgment. And you got it. Both hell and judgment are usually concepts we associate with, this larger concept of end times, which is why we're here today for this bonus episode. And we're going to be breaking down this whole concept of the end times and all the terminology surrounding it. And this episode's almost going to be like a class with all these terms and vocabulary I'm going to introduce. So you might need to listen to this one a few times, take some notes, just to keep your head screwed on straight, because there's a lot of terms we're going to be going over. And of course, we're going to be using some of these terms going forward as we finish this mini-series on what the hell that we're doing. So, there's only about, 16 terms that we're going to go through, so no problem. We got this, right? When Christians speak of end times, the imagery and the pictures that get aroused in our minds, they're usually grim, to say the least. The word that you hear thrown around is the apocalypse, which is our first vocabulary word today. And that word, which might be surprising to you, is completely misleading when you compare it to its original meaning, or its original meaning. And I'm going to talk about that later, but the ways we understand the apocalypse coming from God at the end of the age is usually in, vivid, graphic violence. Are they not? Maybe you've seen a YouTube short or a TV program or a street preacher with a bullhorn and signs warning people of the end times judgment, where there's going to be fire and mass destruction, slaughter, earthquakes, thunder, lightning, smoke, wars, bombs, utter chaos, and all kinds of evil taking place. And it's the end of the world as we know it, right? And isn't that what the end time and soon coming apocalypse is all about? Well, without getting too far into that word apocalypse, I want to step back from that whole concept of mass violence and evil coming to the world at the hand of God, and just simply ask the question, why? The first thing we have to talk about when we bring up this whole idea of end times is, why does Jesus and the grand narrative of the Bible all point to the need to even have to have an end times? Well, we've already talked about this in the opening episodes of this whole podcast when we explored the topic of the problem of evil. The bottom line is that evil, violence, suffering, disease, decay, and death, they're not some part of God's plan, but they're all unwanted enemies that need to be eliminated. God's grand plan for humans and for all creation in the cosmos are for all things to be in peace and wholeness. That's where I use that Hebrew word shalom as an all-encompassing word to describe the harmony when all things are in right relatedness with each other. And certainly when we look at the world now, and gosh, even the universe for that matter, we certainly do not see things in right relatedness with each other. Not even close. There's evil, there's all kinds of senseless violence, there's endless suffering and disease and even cosmic evils. Everything is subject to decay. We've got entropy, and eventually all things just fall apart. They all die. And so the problem of evil lies on the fact that there's all this evil and death around us. But yet, this is not what God wants. And as both the ancient story of the Bible and Jesus' words to us put forward, one day, an age in the future, evil, violence, suffering, disease, decay, and death, even the principles of the universe, are all going to be put to an end or restored. You see, we're living in an age now that's broken. But a new age is coming when all things will be restored and God's shalom will be in effect. That, folks, is what we're talking about when we are saying that there will be an end times. Get it? It's the end of this current age and death and the inauguration of a new age of life and peace. And there's some just beautiful imagery of this new era that can be found in the Bible when it imagines a world without sin and without death and what that would even look like. You know, including when all the cosmic spiritual agents like Satan and his demons who are hell-bent on doing evil, when those guys are nullified. For example, Isaiah chapter 11 talks about this future era when both a lion and a lamb can lay down together and there's no bloodshed between them. Where a cow and a bear can both graze together and no one's trying to kill the other one for food. When no people on earth hurt or destroy because the knowledge of God covers the whole earth and the waters, just like the waters cover the sea. I mean, wow! That's what the knowledge of God is. It's non-violence. Chapter 2 of the same book talks about a day coming where mutual enemies take their swords and their weapons of war, their nuclear bombs, and they beat them into agricultural tools. Where nations no longer lift up sword against other nations and they don't learn war anymore. And in the book of Revelation, which we'll talk about more later in this episode, the last 2 chapters talk about this beautiful restoration coming to the earth where God himself comes and he wipes every tear from our eye. Where every king and ruler opposed to the love of God is brought down to nothing. So there's no more destruction, no more greed, no more evil. And Satan and every evil cosmic force are done away with. So I really hope that gives you a better picture of what that word apocalypse can mean. Because this is the final reality of what the end times is moving toward. Not some day and age where God just wipes everything off the face of the earth and there's nothing left except for heaven. That's not the case at all. What we find instead is a resurrection of the dead and the physical bodies to the earth that's going to be fully restored back to the way it was originally intended to be, which is free from pain, free from suffering and death. The book of Acts chapter 3 verse 21 talks about this as the restoration of all things. Beautiful to imagine, isn't it? And if you're looking for another vocabulary word, the Greek word for restoration in Acts right there is called the apokatastasis. I always imagine polka dots or polka music, apokatastasis. That whole idea of apokatastasis is all about restoration. Not wiping the planet out. It's about repairing and rebuilding, not destruction. This was the same future hope that Jesus' own group of friends had, like Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Let me show you. Now, those 3 were all siblings, and one day Lazarus died. Jesus, however, he had been preaching and doing all types of miracles, including curing people from illnesses that would normally lead them to death. And when Jesus shows up in this family's hometown, Martha walks straight up to Jesus and tells him, Jesus, if you would have been here, my brother would not have been dead. And then she goes on to say, but even now I know that whatever you ask from God, he's going to give you. So clearly, Martha expresses her deep faith here, even believing that Jesus somehow could still bring Lazarus back from the dead. Now, Jesus reflects back what Martha says, but with this rather nebulous reply. He says, yes, Martha, your brother will rise again. It's here with Martha's next reply that we're going to discover our next end times vocabulary word. Because she says this, I know, Jesus, that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Right there. Those last 3 words, the last day. Those are not just some 3 everyday average words thrown together. Embedded right in that phrase comes that Greek word eschatos. Our 3rd vocabulary word of the day. Told you you're going to have to write these down. Which means the end, finality, the uttermost. And this whole idea of the eschatos had huge meaning for first century Jews. I mean, Martha wasn't just nodding her head to some random day in the future when, she said the eschatos word. She was talking about the glorious hope that all Jewish people had about the end times, in which evil was going to be done away with and all things were going to be restored. The time in New Day when all of Israel's foreign enemies would be extinguished, when all the personal and systemic injustices which were rampant of sin would be cleansed, just like they're rampant in our day today, when all of the earth would be restored, and when even the heavenly forces of evil would be vanquished. All of that was rolled up in the concept of the eschatos, or the eschaton if you want to use it as a noun. It was all, it's translated into that word that we have, the last day. And this last day concept, when all things are to be restored and all evil is going to be put away, is an enormous carryover concept from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. It's the same Bible, the same scriptures that Martha would have heard her whole life growing up in first century Israel. The prophets Joel and Amos and Malachi and Ezekiel, and they all pointed to this event, calling it the day of the Lord. So this last day then, this eschatos day, the eschaton, is the day when all is set right. And Martha rightly equated it that would be during this last time when people who had died beforehand would rise, come back into a resurrected body to enjoy this newly restored earth and everlasting time of peace and shalom. She correctly recognized that Jesus was the long-awaited Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible's prophesied hero, the Messiah, whose coming meant that God would be ushering in this last day. To Martha and many of Jesus' followers, especially to those of the likes of Peter, who identified Jesus in Matthew 16 as the Christ, the anointed one to be king, the prophesied coming God, Jesus was the sign that these beautiful end-time prophecies were about to be fulfilled. Jesus was going to bring God's last day. All hopes were on him. But as we all know, something totally unexpected happened with the Messiah, Jesus. And this is where Christianity loses a lot of Jewish folks along the way, because something very surprising happens that was not foretold in their scriptures. Rather than to usher in this whole new global era of shalom and apokatastasis, the Messiah instead dies. And for those brief 3 days when Jesus was dead and lying in the tomb, it must have seemed like all hope was just lost. Man, the Messiah's dead? Maybe this wasn't the guy we're looking for. Maybe we were wrong. Maybe we were wrong to believe that he was going to be the one. And all those questions remained valid until the third day, when Jesus came back to life and was resurrected back into his physical body, showing himself to his followers that he was alive. Unbelievable. The hope was back on. The grand hope that death would be defeated and the eschatos was here. It was back in place, standing right in front of them. You know what's funny? It was only a few days after Jesus' resurrection that some of his followers kind of went back to those old prophecies. They're kind of going, it's great you're alive. However, Jesus, as it says in Acts chapter 1, here's what they said. They said, hey, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Right? Because there's the other part of those prophecies. You see, they're thinking there. His followers were still anticipating this final consummation that the prophets spoke beforehand. The day of the Lord. The grand restoration, that the world was going to be renewed. And specifically that Israel's enemies would be conquered, because the Romans were all around them at this time. They were thinking, and rightly so, our Messiah lives, so now must be the time for the last day to come, when all enemies are going to be put under our feet and peace will be here at last. And that's actually pretty good theological thinking by Jesus' followers, because that's exactly what the Old Testament prophesied. They weren't making this up. The Old Testament clearly said that when the Messiah comes, just as the book of Daniel clearly paints very vividly with the Son of God coming on the clouds of heaven, where all the nations of the earth are subdued, and the Ancient of Days comes and his throne of flaming fire, and he judges all the nations, he eradicates evil, and the new kingdom and age that he sets becomes an everlasting kingdom, becomes an everlasting dominion that never passes away. I mean, that's what's supposed to happen. The Messiah's kingdom will never be destroyed, where all the rulers of the earth and the false demonic rulers of heaven will worship and obey him or be annihilated. I mean, that's the Old Testament promise for when the Messiah comes. Yep, Jesus' followers were right to think that this would be the time when Jesus was going to bring restoration to the world. That's what the Messiah is supposed to do. But as we know, folks, that didn't happen. Instead, Jesus commissions his followers to go and spread the message that he has risen from the dead, that he has conquered the grave, and that those who follow him will also receive this eternal life and be saved from death and all the destructiveness that this current age holds. And then Jesus just goes poof and ascends back to the heavenly realm to be seated at the right hand of God. But hold the phone, stop the presses. This whole idea that the Messiah comes only to leave before the full restoration of the world is completely unheard of in the Hebrew Bible. It's not in the Old Testament. All the prophecies about the Messiah declare that when Messiah comes, man, it's over for evil. When the Messiah comes, he stays, he remains. The Messiah doesn't just come to leave. In fact, the scriptures are so clear on this that this fact is one of the really good proofs that Jewish folks can use against Christians to claim that Jesus was not the Messiah, because there's absolutely none of this leaving business in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, look it up for yourself. It's true. Chat GPT it if you want it, or whatever AI tool you want to use. For we Christians, though, we have had to understand Jesus is coming to earth in the incarnation of Jesus and then leaving after the resurrection. We have to understand that and then try to reconcile that with all the Old Testament promises of shalom and restoration of the earth and doing away with cosmic evil that's supposed to happen when the Messiah comes. Thus, believers in Jesus do not merely hold on to the idea that they will someday go to heaven and avoid the earth and somehow escape sin and evil that way when they die. Hardly. We believe in Jesus' parousia. Parousia. That's our fourth vocabulary word today. I gotta make light of this, right? Because there's just so much. Ding, 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 ding. Winner, winner, winner. Parousia. And that's just the Greek word that means coming or appearing. Followers of Jesus believe in a second coming where Jesus, at that time, the promised final restoration of the cosmos is going to happen. Now, we're not just making this parousia business up to kind of like fill in the gap as to why Jesus left and didn't return, didn't get business done. I mean, almost every one of the New Testament letters that followed after Jesus' death mention the hope of Jesus' second coming. Okay. Hebrews 9, verses 28 through 27, it might be the simplest way this is expressed. Listen to what it says. It says, "And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and then after comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time. But not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him." And now with Jesus' second coming in mind, folks, we're going to make a big shift for the rest of this episode, because Well, all of Christians pretty much agree that there's a last day coming, an eschaton, a day of the Lord, his parousia. Jesus' return, if you look across history, we believe that. Christians have totally disagreed on what this second coming is going to look like and when it's going to come and what are the signs of the time when it comes and when it's close and imminent and what's going to happen on the earth when it does. And will there be a global hierarchical government led by Christ that comes in? And lastly, we disagree about what's going to happen to those who are not in line with Jesus, who haven't repented toward love and who are in total rebellion against him. That's what we disagree about. All those points, we argue about them profusely. I mean, till we're red in the face. And not just, individual people, but entire churches, and not just entire churches, entire denominations. Some denominations, entire groups of churches are they're separate because of how they view the end times differently. The churches have split over this stuff. Some preachers and teachers are banned from going to other churches because they don't have the same view. I mean, this is major stuff. These are fighting words. In Jesus' parousia, including the various views on hell and what that is, right? The differing views on that. We can sum all of this in the study and the arguments about it under our fifth vocabulary word, which is eschatology. Yep, that word, it might sound like it goes back to that same Greek word eschatos that we already talked about concerning the last day. Eschatology is the study, the theology, the opinions about the whats and the whens and the hows about the last day. Wrapped up in eschatology then is of course the resurrection of the dead and that other huge concept, judgment. And since we're smack in the middle looking at this word judgment in our series on hell and what that all looks for Christians and what that looks for unbelievers at the second coming of Jesus, we all need to be on the same page on some of these terms and concepts. I mean, we've mentioned 5 of them so far: apocalypse, eschaton, apokatastasis, parousia, and now eschatology. And with those, we're now going to dive another layer down deeper and hit the next level on some of these end time terms and concepts. So if what came before wasn't heavy enough, buckle your seatbelt. Here we go. And you know me, I like to build a story up before I get to these, so get comfortable. So there's these 3 eschatological aspects I'm going to address for the remainder of this episode. The why, the when, and the how. Now I've already talked about the why, which is that in order for shalom to be brought to the earth, evil needs to be dealt with in finality. It needs to be put to an end. And it's only when death is fully eradicated that this universe is going to reflect the love and character of God, and all is going to be righted. So that answers at least one side of the why question. But there's another side to that why question as well. And that is, well, why didn't Jesus just bring the kingdom in fullness when he came to the earth the first time? Why instead commission humans to continue his ministry and then leave to only come back at a later time to finish up the job? And I don't have time to answer all the ins and outs of that question, but it's certainly worthy to think about, right? And there's no place in the New Testament that just clearly tells us why this is the case. The Old Testament, guys, doesn't even prophesy that this is going to happen to the Messiah. So it's almost as if God came in the person of Jesus and then revealed a completely different work and plan that just caught everybody off guard. Now, for folks that hold to that traditional view of hell that we talked about, Jesus' failure to bring full apokatastasis now and instead return back to God has often been understood so that humanity has one last chance to repent. The thinking goes is that if Jesus would have brought the kingdom in fullness when he first came, there'd be no one left to enjoy the new kingdom. Why? Because you first have to believe in Jesus before you can have the legal penalty of sin removed just to enter the kingdom. If you haven't believed, then you're still guilty of sin, which means God has to violently wipe you out instead. Therefore, Jesus reveals himself as the one and only way to God when he first comes to earth. He then commissions his disciples to preach that gospel so that people can first believe and have the opportunity to be saved. And then at his parousia, his second coming, those who have been saved can avoid destruction and enjoy the new kingdom. And I talked about some of these legal consequences actually quite a bit in depth when we went through the series about why did Jesus have to die. So I don't come from this particular view, and you can listen to all about that in those episodes. But I know that this is what I always worried about and was going to be the case when I was a teenager in my early 20s and when I got into college and started going to a Baptist church. And I went there with my fiance at the time, and it was the same message they were preaching. And I remember one of the services, the preacher had a big transparent water cooler on stage. And about 5 minutes before the message ended, he walked over to it and flipped it on. And the water started coming out. And he says, starts going into this long monologue. Time is running out. But sinners have a chance right now before it's all over. And of course, he launched into a pretty intense mini sermon on hell. The traditional view of hell. And this guy, man, he must have had this rehearsed and timed out perfectly. I commend him for this because at the end, when he said to us, eventually, time is going to run out. You could hear the last drips of water drip, 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 coming out of the cooler. And then that water cooler was totally empty. Boy, he sure had our attention. It was quiet in that church. And there's aspects of that analogy that I totally agree with. It's impossible to read Jesus' words in the Gospels and the letters of the New Testament and not feel and be compelled to this very urgent and this urgency in his message. Clearly, the time to turn from self-centeredness and to turn to God's redeeming love is right now. I agree, without delay. And the New Testament warns in very strong terms that there are consequences for remaining in our sins, especially at this parousia. All of us are going to be subject to God's judgment when Jesus returns and when God's restoration is enacted. The longer we stay in that condition of sin, whether you think you're saved or not saved, the more damage you do to ourselves and to others and to creation. So I absolutely agree with the urgency that was presented in that sermon. But when that water runs out of the cooler, which was meant to represent Jesus' second coming, his parousia, his return, I do have some different views about how God's judgment is going to look like and what might be the ultimate fate for those who didn't receive Jesus in this lifetime. And I know I go against the grain with that, but I have some pretty fun things I want to share and compelling things. And I really think there's going to be more going on in the story of how God deals with the unrepentant at his parousia. Just like there was more going on when Jesus came and then left. I really do. And we're going to be talking about that more as we continue through this series on what the hell. And we're going to come back to that question of how the end times are all going to work out a little bit more as we finish this episode. But let's move on. All right, now we've taken the time to address the why behind the needs of the end times. Now let's take the bulk of the time left to talk about the when. Because especially for us Americans, there has been an absolute hyper-focus on trying to figure out when Jesus' return will happen and what things are going to accompany that within a timeline. And so to move forward here and get us on the same page, we're going to go into some terms. So hang on to your hat for that. They're going to be coming here in just a minute. But before I get into those terms, I want to read this passage that Jesus spoke when he spoke about his return. We already read from the book of Acts how before Jesus ascended back into heaven, his followers were asking him, hey, are you going to bring the kingdom now in fullness and bring this grand restoration to Israel? And we read that. which pretty much tells you what was on their minds at the time. But I stopped short there and didn't give you Jesus' response, did I? Let me read Acts 1, verse 6, and then put 7 in there as well. This was Jesus' response. So it says, when they had come together, they asked him, his disciples asked him, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? And he said to them, it's not for you to know the times or seasons that the Father has fixed by his own authority. Listen, guys, I don't know how much more plain Jesus could have been with his disciples. Did you hear what he said? It's not for us to know the times or even the seasons for when Jesus' return is going to be evident. Wow. Can it get any more obvious? And even before this passage from Acts, which is after Jesus' death and resurrection, Jesus was saying these same things in his teaching and his parables. Look at Luke chapter 12. Jesus uses an analogy between a thief who comes to steal your house in the middle of the night. He tells them, guys, if you knew when the thief was coming, you wouldn't leave the house at night. with verse saying, therefore, you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you're not going to expect. Jesus is clear. We're not going to know when Jesus' parousia is going to come. We don't even know anything about these last days, the eschaton, and when that's going to arrive. It's like a thief in the night. Jesus is clear. We're not going to know these things in advance. But boy, that said, the human tendency is to not be satisfied by that. We're just uncomfortable with saying, well, Jesus is coming back one day in the future to fix everything, and just leave it at that, right? We're far too curious to want to know more about the specifics. You know, what exact time and what method and all that business. What's going to happen to those sinners, right? Because we feel like we're so justified to say that. And on top of that, there has been a tendency by some folks to take the passages of the Bible that allude and that imagine this last day and then search for hidden codes and obsess about numerology and try to calendarize these passages, even to try to, predicting the exact dates for when the end is going to come and by what means. And because Christians have done this, and I was guilty of this long ago too, that brings us to two swaths of scripture that we got to go through, at least touch on. Matthew chapters 24 and 25, and of course the whole book of Revelation. And that's not all of them, but those are just the ones I want to bring out today. What we've got here with these two passages is that on one hand, we've got Jesus as clear as a bell statements and teachings that we are not going to know the date of his return or even the seasons. I get excited about that. The other hand, we have these other two swaths in the New Testament where we are given quite vivid descriptions and displays and imaginative graphic details and grandiose images to express to us the gravity of Jesus' parousia and what we can liken it to, how we can imagine it. And many, especially in the evangelical tradition of the last 200 years, have taken Matthew 24 and 25 in the book of Revelation and interpreted them to mean that in these little places of the Bible, God actually did hand down to us a literal timeline for how the end is going to unfold. With Revelation, of course, being God's full unveiling of how the end's going to look like and when it all starts and what's going to happen, and we can even set your watch to it. Where do I fall in this evangelical interpretation? Well, I grew up in a church that had this hyper focus on end times prophecy. I'm extremely familiar with it. We even looked at many of the world events that took place in the 20th century as if the Bible's prophecies were written down for our time. That the first century authors of the New Testament, like John and Matthew, and heck, even some of those guys in the Old Testament, like in Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Daniel and all these prophetic Old Testament stuff, they were giving warnings not to the Christians for the last 1900 years of the church, but specifically to us who are living in the 20th century. like World War I and World War II and the reestablishment of Israel in 1948. This was all prophesied. And then the formation of the United Nations. And then the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was all prophesied. And then, of course, in the late 2000s, I wasn't a part of the church then, but came all the fascinations with the astrological events called these blood moons and things like that. All that stuff was written for us in the 20th and 21st century. And many from the conservative evangelical camp claimed that these global, cataclysmic 20th century events, they were all prophesied ahead of time in the Bible, and that they were the very signs that the New Testament authors wrote about to tell us that the end was about to begin and that Jesus was about to return. And then when Jesus didn't return, of course, we had the book of Revelation and other passages like Matthew 24 and 25 that tell us exactly how and when the end was going to come. Oh, brother, none of the junk that they predicted ever came true. And having grown up in a church with all this hyped up sense of prophecy and then watching, from a little kid all the way up into your early 20s, watching all that stuff in the church just fail, all those predictions come to naught, I don't hold too much stock in the idea that predicting exact future events in the 20th century or now in the 21st century was the purpose why the New Testament authors wrote what they did concerning the end times. Nor do I hold the idea that the book of Revelation is some secret calendar or some hidden code that was given to us to know when and how the different events of Jesus' return would play out. But despite the failed prophecies and failed timelines, I'm telling you, for the last 200 years, originating with John Nelson Darby in the 1800s with dispensationalism and continuing up to the present age with the Left Behind series and the John Scofield Bible, years back. And, many American evangelical Christians have set a timeline to both Matthew 24 and 25 and the book of Revelation. Because of that, it forces us kind of to address this and cover these terms associated with all of it. So that's what we're going to do now. But I hope you can take Jesus' words and take them to heart about it's not for us to know the times and the seasons. All right, moving on. Our next set of vocabulary words are going to deal with prophecy. Jesus prophesied his own death. He said it was going to come before it came, and it happened. That's a good definition of the kind of prophecy we're talking about here. And the Bible is full of prophecies that Jesus fulfilled, which helps add proof that he was the Messiah. Jesus and the authors of the New Testament also spoke about what sort of conditions the world was going to be in when his judgments and his return played out. They were prophesying when they did this, telling us what would come to be. And I totally agree with that. No issue there. What many evangelical Christians argue about concerning these prophecies is when these conditions will, or maybe have already played out. And there's three terms that go hand in here, and they are preterism, partial-preterism, and futurism. There you go. There's your vocabulary words 6, 7, and 8. Now, preterism is this idea that all of the grand events and pictures about God's judgment at the end times has already happened. Now, futurism is that all of the events and pictures about God's judgment at the end times hasn't happened yet, but definitely will. And partial preterism is kind of like a mixture of the two. Now, the differences in these I can best explain by looking at those two chapters from Matthew 24 and 25. You can read them on your own because I'm not going to do that here. But Matthew 24, though, it starts off like this. This is the context for both those chapters. You have to know this if you're going to look at any end time stuff or parousia stuff for these chapters. Verse 1 says that Jesus left the temple in Jerusalem and was going away. When his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple, they're like, "Ooh, look at that building. Ooh, look at that, look at that. Aren't these marvelous?" But Jesus answered them, "You see all these, don't you? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And verse 3 says, as Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, hey man, tell us when these things are going to be. And what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? The disciples here are amazed that Jesus said that their glorious temple of worship was going to be destroyed at some point in the future. Jesus is predicting the future here. He's prophesying, and his disciples are now coming around him privately, to his own people, trying to get some more details as to when and what the signs will accompany. The same event, right, with the disciples coming to Jesus privately here, it's recorded in both Mark 13 and Luke 21. And both of them read differently. However, they have the disciples coming to Jesus asking this, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when these things are supposed to take place? It's a little tiny difference, but it's huge. And that makes a lot of sense because Jesus is talking about the temple being destroyed, the physical temple at Jerusalem. And the disciples are asking for a timeline and what type of indicators are going to be visible before this happens. And those two books, Mark and Luke, place the subject matter squarely on the temple being destroyed. And that's it. Nothing about a second coming. But notice when you read that book of Matthew passage, first 3 verses of 24, the disciples asked Jesus, when will these things be? Which is talking about the temple being destroyed right there. And then the text goes on to say, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Your coming, that's the Greek word, parousia right there. Jesus is coming. And it also says, at the end of the age, at the end of the time. You see, this Matthew passage, it seems to conflate two different things. Where the Mark and Luke passages, they don't do that. Mark has the disciples just asking, when is this temple going to be destroyed? So does Luke, and that's it. But Matthew has the disciples conflating both the destruction of the temple, but also asking about Jesus' parousia, his coming, when everything is going to be restored. That's so important to note here. Now, as a side note, it's debatable whether these disciples, at this point, before the crucifixion and before the resurrection, knew that Jesus was going to leave and have a second coming. Remember, we read from Acts that when Jesus was resurrected, and they were asking him right then and there if he was going to restore the kingdom of God, if the apokatastasis was going to start. And remember, when Jesus died, all the disciples were moping around the next few days. Pretty hopeless, right? Not really expecting anything else to happen. So I don't think they knew in Matthew, when these two chapters, that they knew that there was going to be some second coming. No, many of the disciples, I was going to say, and when Jesus did rise from the dead, it's not like they're like, aha, I knew that was going to happen. No, many of the disciples, they had to be convinced that Jesus had actually rose from the dead because it came out of nowhere to them. And if that's the case, guys, how do we explain this passage in Matthew where it looks like the disciples are asking about Jesus' second coming in advance before they had any idea of it? And of course, if you go on to read these chapters in Matthew, Jesus mentions with a certain level of detail as to what some of these signs of the times will be, or might be, along with an urgency to stay faithful to God and be ready. So this is a good question, right? Now, I don't have time to explain or go into the ins and outs of how different scholars and Bible teachers explain this discrepancy, but a lot of it does ride on a true historical event that actually happened with the temple. Because the temple in Jerusalem did get destroyed, just as Jesus predicted. But it didn't happen till 70 AD, like almost 40 years later. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem is a known fact, historical, not just some theoretical fulfillment of prophecy that, can't be proven. Many of the stones of the temple were actually thrown down. Like Jesus said, they have some of those original stones laying at the bottom of the temple when the Romans overthrew those stones way back in the first century. It's right by that western wall in Israel. I saw them when I was there in Israel in 2019. And since the temple's destruction that Jesus predicted in Matthew 24 did come true, follow me now, then isn't it the case that everything else that Jesus said in Matthew 24 and 25 must have also come true during that time? Well, that's the debate, folks. A full-blown preterist, back to our terminology, would say yes, everything that Jesus prophesied about took place. It's already happened. They don't see the language of the temple's destruction and Jesus' coming, his parousia, as two separate ideas, but the same. There was some coming of Jesus that happened in 70 AD when that temple was destroyed. And if you look at some of their arguments and reasonings, I think, they make some good points here and there, and it's worthy to explore if you want to check that out. Points we don't have time to go over here. But the major problem with that full preterist view comes toward the end of Matthew 24 and into chapter 25. And I'm going to read Matthew 24, starting in verse 29, to show you this. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, talking about the temple being destroyed, it says, the sun's going to be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken, all those demonic cosmic forces of evil. And then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Jesus says there, after those days, after the temple is destroyed, his own presence is going to come and be made known to the whole earth. He's not just making up new content here when he describes his coming. Jesus uses the grandiose imagery from chapter 7 of the book of Daniel that talks about the Messiah coming on the clouds and arriving in glory. And Jesus is doing that just so that it is clear he is associating that Son of Man with himself. That's what he's doing there. But as we all know, as far as we can tell, Jesus' appearance, his parousia to the world, and the gathering of all of his people, it hasn't taken place yet, right? That much is obvious. His parousia isn't here. At least nothing we can see. So that's the problem with full preterism. You have to come up with other ways to explain how those later prophecies, and at the end of 24 and all of chapter 25, of the Son's glorious world-revealing and gathering, you have to explain how that somehow did already happen. And those who hold the full preterism, which they're a minority, as you can imagine, have some very creative explanations for that. You should check them out. But at least for me, they're not that convincing. And that's where partial preterism comes in, which is where I am personally at. Partial preterists agree that, hey, much of what he said about his Mount Olivet discourse here in Matthew chapter 4 did take place with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. However, tacked on to the end of Matthew 24 here and going into 25, there's a more fuller promise of the Messiah's coming to the whole world, wherein judgment takes place and evil is fully eradicated, and that has not yet been fulfilled. Where every tear is wiped from our eyes, and death is no more, right? And so you don't need to tell you that it's pretty obvious to look around the world now and see that every tear has not been wiped away from our eyes. So us partial preterists see both a fulfillment of Jesus' prophecies in Matthew 24 and 25 with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and we also see a future coming fulfillment when Jesus' return brings full judgment, apokatastasis, and restoration. A futurist is someone who doesn't believe that any of the prophecies Jesus spoke here in Matthew have come true. And all this content in Matthew 24 is still out there. somewhere in the future. Well, however, most people tend to fall in the partial-preterist camp, and I hope by explaining those terms, that gives you a better understanding of how people interpret some of these, end-time prophecies, and especially concerning Matthew 24 and 25. But we're going to move on. Now to the book of Revelation. I've really got my work cut out for me because I know we're coming to, we're running out of time. I don't like to go more than an hour on these, but the book of Revelation, man, it's got its own end-time terminology and its own concepts, because it's here where another huge controversy arises. Just to start, it's a pretty big book, so there's a lot of content here you have to be familiarized with to just even weigh in on the topic. And man, it's chocked full of mysterious, ominous, nebulous, prophetic, cosmic, heavenly, battle, warfare, murderous imagery, including seals being opened, bowls of wrath being poured on the earth, dragons, beasts, all kinds of pictures of evil that culminates into the last two chapters, chapter 21 and 22, when after all the earth's battle and destruction has taken place, Jesus finally emerges victorious and brings a final restoration to all the earth and the cosmos. Whew. That's a good summary of Revelation. Just a little background. The book itself is highly contested, even way back in the early centuries when the church was just getting going, and before it even had a firm grasp on what the books in the New Testament should be, before the canon was formally canonized. And for a number of reasons, it's always been one of those books with wide and diverse interpretations, with those who claim they get it, as if it's like a holy end times code book, or who think that by understanding that book they have the key to the whole end times figured out, all the way to those who they just try to chill out and take a more allegorical view, and all the way to those like Martin Luther who are like, hey guys, let's just get rid of this whole book. Let's just get rid of it. It's, it might be edifying, but it doesn't have Jesus in it. That was kind of his deal. Throughout history, people have used this book to claim that the book was directly predicting future events for the time they were living in. Whether it was cultural events or political events or world disasters like earthquakes, as if you could just look around and see what's going on in your world and say, aha, that's what the author of the book of Revelation was writing about, predicting the very things you're experiencing. And the thing with that is that people in the 3rd century did that, and 7th century, and 16th century, and 18th century, 19th. Everyone thinks it's for them, right? Like in the early church, the great beast that's in the book of Revelation that was wreaking havoc on the earth and coming to destroy, well, it was often seen as a Roman government who is persecuting the church, which makes sense given the time that the book was written. But of course, when the Roman government absorbed Christianity into the state and Jesus did not return, well, that kind of put an end to that theory. Unless you're going to throw that book out, maybe it's been fulfilled, but no, we keep it, so it must have greater meaning. So when the reformers like John Calvin and Martin Luther came around the 16th century, the great beast of Revelation, the great whore, that's the Catholic Church. We got to rebel against that or change things. So, and then later on, some suggested it was Napoleon, and then of course Hitler or Pol Pot, or now some say it's the rise of AI technology. And just like with all those examples, those events come and go, and Jesus' return never comes. And I guess we're going to have to wait and see with the AI thing. Maybe that is what it is. But this has been the grand temptation all throughout church history, where certain groups begin to take the events in Revelation, treat them as literal, and then look for literal events in past or future history and say that those are the things John prophesied about in Revelation, and then say that and claim that the end is near. I grew up in a church just like this, and it was called the Worldwide Church of God, where everything that was happening in the world was to be viewed through an end-time lens. I didn't even think I was going to make it to be 18 years old because there was so much hype about Jesus' return. So no, I don't take this view on Revelation. I believe there's a way to look at Revelation through a non-violent, Jesus-looking lens. Even though Revelation is littered with warfare and battle imagery, and that many times on a surface level, it seems to show Jesus and God being violent. I recognize that, but I'm going to be giving more hints about how I see Jesus and his non-violent lens in this book as we go through our What the Hell series. But coming back to that word apocalypse now, that I mentioned at the very beginning of the episode, that word actually means to reveal. Look it up. That's what it means, apocalypse. The first 4 words of the book of Revelation says, the apocalypse of Jesus Christ. I guess that's 5, the apocalypse of Jesus, right? Which literally means the revealing of Jesus, or the revelation of Jesus, as some translations, like I think the NIV puts. And when you take a fine-tooth comb to this book and search for Jesus, the Jesus that appeared to us in his most greatest display of glory, which is on the cross, you actually find a lot of non-violence hidden in here. Wow. You actually find a lot of things that look like the cross. You have to be looking for it. And that's what I'll be sharing in some of these later episodes on the topic of what the hell. But for that vocabulary word, apocalypse, begin to imagine that being a revelation of the person of Jesus. Not about how a book is revealing bloodshed and death and destruction coming from the hand of God, because I really believe it's supposed to be revealing Jesus himself. But there are 2 topics from the book of Revelation for our terminology and concepts that I'm going to briefly mention here. The first one being tribulation. That should be our 9th vocabulary word. Revelation, that book depicts God's people going through like intense hardship as they walk out their faith. I mean, extreme hardship, even with wretched persecutions. This was absolutely the case for the early church. This actually happened to them with some of the first persecutions coming from the Jewish religious leaders opposing Christians, and then with other local governments, and then the national government of Rome coming after Christians. And embedded in Revelation, it appears to be a time where the persecution is enhanced. The intensity is up, the thermometer goes up, the burner's turned up to a great degree upon like the whole world, and especially for followers of Jesus. In this time of enhanced and intense suffering, if you take it literally, we often call this the tribulation. This tribulation is going to come, and it's interpreted to take place just before Jesus' return. For those who take this tribulation as a literal event, many of them say that it's going to last like 7 years. And they fall into different camps as to what this means for Christians. Some will say it's going to be really rough for Christians, that many are going to die, but that the testimony of giving your life for Jesus, even to the point of death, is part of God's plan. And so martyrdom, to give your life to the cause, is looked at, of course it's unwanted, but it's a necessary part of following Jesus. Which kind of makes sense, because that's what Jesus did for us to draw him, or to draw us to him, into his non-violent self-sacrificial love. However, others have proposed this completely other theory, which you really can't find much history of it in the church until the 19th century, with people like John Nelson Darby and the beginning of dispensationalism, which is our next vocabulary word, which is the rapture. The rapture, man, it's this huge idea in the American evangelical church, which says that before Jesus' earthly return, man, the world's going to go to hell in a handbasket. And everything's going to break out into chaos and death. But right before this tribulation happens, God's going to literally just go poof and physically remove Christians from the earth and bring them into heaven so that they will be protected from God's fiery end-time judgment. And of course, different churches, different denominations, there's a lot of nuance of what this is exactly going to look like, depending on, what Christian leader or church you follow, but many of them trace their steadfast faith and that God's going to protect them from disaster via rapture, you can go all the way back to the book of Genesis with Noah and the flood in chapters 6 through 8, and how his families were protected from evil. So, the church I grew up taught that there would be something similar to this, that the time of tribulation on the earth, there would be a rapture for the faithful where they are protected from it. But I don't hold on to those views anymore, because the book of Revelation is so vague with its grandiose prophetic imagery and its contents. You could literally apply them to any century and against any oppressor and make it to conform to any type of cataclysmic world event or leader. And I just don't find a whole lot of evidence for this rapture thing as well. And it's far too easy for an influential or charismatic church leader to say, look everyone, here's a sign of the times, and the rapture's close, and you're not going to have to go through suffering, even though the first 3 centuries of the church, they went through tons of suffering. If anyone needed to be raptured, it was them. They were burned at the stake. They were eaten by wild lions in the Colosseum, and they had hot oil poured onto them. People crucified upside down. I think they needed to be raptured more than anybody else. But that's not what happened to them. And you can have preachers that preach this, that the end is coming soon, and it feeds upon the fear. And man, having grown up in a church where all their predictions were a big flop, and then stepping back and looking at church history and realizing, God, there's been lots of people that have said the same thing and flopped. Well, I just don't hold much water in interpreting Revelation that way. Especially since this whole idea of the rapture didn't even become popular until the 1900s. You can't even find anything, barely, if there is at all, about the rapture in the centuries prior. It's a very new development. But regardless of my opinions on the matter, hey, the terminology for us to know is the rapture. And there's 2 subterms within the rapture that we need to know too, which are pre-trib and post-trib. Pre-trib means exactly what I've been talking about. That before life gets really bad on planet Earth, God comes and takes you out of it and protects you so you don't have to go through it. Post-tribulation is the other idea that yes, a period of really bad time is going to come, literally. Christians, however, are going to go through it. There is no escaping bad times for those who hold the post-tribulation views. But post-tribs often do believe in a rapture-like event that happens just before Jesus comes back, and after there's been lots of years of this intense suffering. And post-tribs are caught up in the air to meet Jesus, and then they descend down from heaven together in a grand procession as Jesus returns in his glory. And so those are 2 more vocab words for you to know. Pre-trib, that's I guess number 11, and post-trib, it's our 12th vocabulary word. Oh my gosh, this is a lot, but it needs to be done. Now, as I finish up with 3 more terms at the end here, many of these terms and concepts I'm describing, they're all dependent upon one thing, which is the physical return of Jesus to the earth. And I mean, Jesus did make promises about something like this, right? Matthew 24, he says he's going to come on clouds to gather his people and wipe out evil and suffering, and the cosmic rulers of earth, he's going to take care of them. And then after Jesus ascended into heaven, his followers did say in Acts chapter 1, verse 11, saying, hey man, this Jesus who has just been taken up into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go. And there's all kinds of passages in the New Testament where it talks about Jesus' later coming, his later appearing, his revealing. We read one of those from Hebrews chapter 9, that it's all going to take place at the eschaton, the end of the day. So yes, I do endorse Jesus' physical parousia. But another source of contention about his return comes up in Revelation chapters 19 and 20. 19 has this imagery where Jesus finally comes out of heaven with a heavenly army and comes to the earth to destroy all the kings of the earth who oppose him, and to finally capture the beast and its false prophet and remove them from their influence. And this is often viewed as Jesus' actual return. There it is, Revelation 19. That's what a lot of people view it as, where he comes and puts an end to the tribulation. Chapter 20 then shows Satan, the serpent, being locked up for a period of 1,000 years exactly, with like a mini resurrection of sorts of the dead who had remained faithful to God. Well, although some folks believe this will be a resurrection of all past believers, right? But either way, for those who take these chapters, 19 and 20, as literal events in a literal timeline, 1,000 years exactly, mark it to the calendar, set your watch, that's called millennialism. Millennialists are those who believe that when Jesus returns, he's going to first rule on earth for a period of 1,000 years. Well, not all millennialists, but we'll get to that in a second. Oftentimes setting up a government-like system with tiers and structures that are in line with his views and values. And after this 1,000-year reign, Satan is released for a short period of time, kind of like to clean house and get rid of all those who really are still not in line with Jesus' kingdom. And then after that, Satan finally meets his last demise, and he's thrown in a lake of fire for good. Then, everybody who has ever lived is resurrected, or maybe just those who rejected God are resurrected, since some think that all the God-fearing people already were resurrected before this 1,000 years, but that's nuance again. And then what happens, people stand before God's white throne of judgment to either spend eternity with God in heaven or eternity in hell. With the last chapters of Revelation 21 and 22, it's that final, everything's done. The final consummation of peace on earth. We're almost done here, folks. Now, within this whole idea of a millennium, there's at least 3 different views here. There's probably 3,000 views, but the 3 main ones is you can be premillennial. That's our vocabulary word 14, which means you can believe in a literal 1,000-year reign at the initial return of Christ. Jesus comes first, and then there's 1,000 years. And there's a temporary release of Satan and his final judgment in the lake of fire that happens after. And then a final resurrection and judgment that comes after that. That's a premillennial. Or you can be post-millennial, which means that the world isn't really going to hell in a handbasket before Jesus' return. The world actually gets better before Christ's return because the gospel message gets preached and accepted and things improve as a result. And I think Jonathan Edwards of America in the 1800s held this view. The 1,000-year period, the 1600s? I can't remember. But this 1,000-year period in Revelation there is taken symbolically. So there isn't a literal 1,000 years. And Jesus returns to celebrate the world's conversion with one big mass resurrection that accompanies it. Or you can be amillennial. I think, was that 15, 16? Vocabulary word 16. Where again you take a more symbolic view of this 1,000-year reign. It's not literal. However, what's different with an amillennial is that you do see Jesus' second return as him coming to rescue the world from cosmic evil and its influence and put an ultimate end to suffering and death. It's not that you're necessarily thinking that there's like a specific 7-year tribulation of intensity before this millennium. No, you're not thinking that, but you're definitely seeing Jesus is coming to save a situation that would not be saved without his direct intervention. And when this lake of fire business takes place with the devil, and when this resurrection all happens, you're not relating it to like a literal 1,000-year reign. And all these millennium views, there's nuance and there's debate, there's different timelines and borrowing from one another. And, there's probably 1,000 different interpretations and combinations of all these terms I've mentioned, especially in Revelation. However, most of the divisions we have in the church about the end times, it all comes down to whether you're looking at things in the book of Revelation as literal or symbolic. And that's a huge debate, and those are fighting words. Those are going to split your church apart. Those puts mother against father, and people get really bent out of shape out of them. I mean, I have a huge conflict with my own family on some of this stuff. It's super sad that we can't come to agreement on this stuff, or, just respect our different views. We become dogmatic on this stuff, and it creates so much internal conflict and accusations and needless strife. And as I can attest to, it leads to a lot of extremism, a lot of fear, and a lot of false speculation. And I've experienced that myself. And so I'm guessing it doesn't surprise you to say that I take an amillennial view, and I don't try and read too much into timelines or calendarizing the book of Revelation. I find, or I try to find, the crucified Christ and his other-oriented love in this book. It's not easy at times. And for those of you who stick with me in this mini-series on hell, we're going to find some of these pictures, and they're going to be awesome. And if you struggle with any of this stuff, man, it is going to set you free. Amen. All right, with this episode now complete, I hope that gives you a better idea of some of these terms and concepts. When we think of end times and hell, and a lot of what we talked about today, we didn't address what's going to be the fate of those who reject God and then find themselves at this parousia, at this millennium, or at this great white throne of judgment, however you want to say it. So we're going to go back to our regularly scheduled programming on that and continue the discussion in our ongoing series on what the hell. So, wow, that's 16 vocabulary words. So have fun at keeping track of all that and all the little idiosyncrasies and variations that go with them. So that's it for now. Be blessed.